Welcome in, everyone. Welcome to the Buddhist Wisdom Podcast. Once again, I'm joined by the amazing Sharon Salzberg. Welcome, Sharon.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's really a gift to have you here again, and especially our topic where we're going to talk about working with anxiety from both a Buddhist perspective and also just general meditation perspective. So I'm really looking forward to that. Just to introduce you a bit, Sharon, to those listeners who are possibly been living on a deserted island for the last 40 years. No offense to anyone out there. But I'm sure you know Sharon, but I'll just introduce her anyway. So Ms. Sharon Salzberg has over 40 years of experience guiding retreats and teaching the transformative power of meditation, insight, and loving kindness practices. Sharon has touched the lives of countless individuals, including myself. And she has best-selling books, Real Love, Loving Kindness. I believe 12 books in all, unless one's come out since the last time I interviewed you, but I believe 12. And really, like I said, has benefited countless people and is really a pioneer of meditation, not only in the United States, but generally in the West. So, yeah, wonderful to have you, Sharon, and your beautiful wisdom, to share on this topic.
Oh, thank you again.
Sorry, I'm just full of compliments today. It's sunny out, so it made me smile.
It's kind of sunny here too in Massachusetts, but it's getting to be dusk and it's dark very soon.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, you're an hour ahead. So just to kick us off on this topic, which is, is a wide one, and I think just something pervasive in all of our lives. We all have to experience some kind of anxiety or fear. I just love to really hear your journey with. I mean, I'm assuming you've had some kind of anxiety in your life at a certain point. I don't think that's assuming too much. Just we all have to experience some. So I'm just kind of wondering, like your early life experience with anxiety, if things came up for you, and what did you use to kind of work with anxiety in early life before you met meditation and the Dharma? I'm just sort of curious.
I actually don't know that anxiety was that prevalent in my life before I went to India when I was 18.
Yeah.
So I had a lot going on, and a lot of trauma, but if anything, I was more numb, and not. I knew I was unhappy, which is why I went to India to try to learn how to meditate. But I don't know that I had that kind of sophistication to know the different dimensions of things that I was feeling. And it was only more apparent to me once I began meditating, which was the first introspection I'd ever really done. I'd never been in therapy before. Yeah. I mean, I'm sure it was there, and cooking, but I am, for example, this is not about anxiety, but about anger, somewhat famous for once having marched up to my first meditation teacher, who was S.N. Goenka, and looking him in the eye and saying, I never used to be an angry person before I started meditating. Of course, thereby laying blame where it was his fault, and needless to say, I'd been hugely angry, but I had not really been in touch with it. So once I began meditating or began really looking within, which is basically what it was, I could see both anxiety and fear. I was a very fearful person. I think that was clear anyway.
Yeah.
But I didn't see how it worked within me until I looked within. So one of the first examples I had was with my very first meditation instruction that I received, which was sit down and feel your breath, feel the sensations of the in and out breath, which was difficult for me for many reasons, including almost as soon as this breath was beginning, I'd kind of mentally lean forward to get ready for the next one or the next 50. And I was very hypervigilant. I was very frightened. I didn't know what might happen next. A lot had already happened to me in my life. I had to be ready for it. And so for me, balance in those days looked like saying to myself, settle back, let the breath come to you. Or I used to say, you're breathing anyway. All
Mm,
you need to do is feel it. And I had so much performance anxiety. It's like I'd never done it before, you know? So it was like, settle back, let the breath come to you. So all of that was intuitive. You know, I'm leaning forward. I'm like hyper vigilant. I need to just come back. That was
mm,
maybe the first. And then as I got kind of clearer and more aware of many dimensions, and something I often say, talking about myself and fear, uh, and I should say, you know, in terms of mindfulness practice, it would be more not so much like, what am I afraid of and what am I going to do about it? And do I need a new therapist? Or, you know, but like, what is this feeling? What does fear feel like? What does it feel like in my body? What's the fear movie? What's it look like as it
mm.
plays out? What other emotions are maybe embedded in it? Things like that. And one of the things I saw as a very personal kind of insight was that, unlike the world's pronouncement that we're afraid of the unknown, which of course is true, I get really afraid when I think I do know and it's going to be really bad. And it's all the stories I start to tell myself, like, and that's the pattern I can see even now. Not that I get caught in it in the same way, but I see that's the manifestation. You know, like, I'm going to go back to New York City. I haven't been in my apartment for 7 months because of this pandemic. And, you know, I'm going to turn on the faucet. What if I turn on the faucet and, you know, I get Legionnaire's disease? That's what I read. Some people, you know, what are the symptoms? What am I going to do in the middle of the night? You know, and if I remind myself, even in that arc of anxiety or fear, you know what, you don't know, then I relax. Then there's space. You know, so coming to understand that tendency has been very important.
Yeah. Yeah. And a very specific one, this one of, I guess we can name it. Sometimes I have a very similar one. I call it future tripping, because
Mhm.
future tripping can be sort of fantasy about something in the future, but it could also be, that worked up anxiety of what's going to happen. And, would you say that's maybe part of a negativity bias? Like, would that be included if we're thinking of maybe a negative thing is going to happen?
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe my favorite example of that is my friend, my colleague Sylvia Borstein, who describes herself as a recovering catastrophizer.
Yeah.
And she'll say she got into meditation practice in part because she said, I was the kind of person who I'd call one of my adult children. And, you know, she's now 87, so her children are really adults. I'd call one of my adult children and they didn't answer the phone. So I was sure the worst had happened. It never occurred to me they were taking a shower.
Yeah.
Or, you know, maybe they fell in love. They don't feel like talking to their mother. And of course, life being what it is, sometimes the worst does happen, but not like every time, you know? And she, I would bet anything, would say she has some of the same thoughts. She has so much more space. Her relationships with her kids are probably better, you know? Um, and she doesn't feel that kind of nervous system consequence. So I was talking to her not so long ago, and she said, I have a new mantra, you know, a new saying. So I said, what is it? And she said, not every bus will end up in a ditch.
That's great. I'm going to use that one. um, so much depth in what you were sharing too on your early practice experiences, and which is quite different than mine. I mean, in the sense that I think intuitively, I really struggled with breath practice as an example, because that's usually the first thing we come into contact with in meditation in the West. And now I kind of understand why, having had some more teachings on in the Tibetan Buddhist traditions on the way breath is connected to energy and how we need to sometimes work with the energy first, and or the breath can help for some people. But it took me a while. I think I needed to be pointed out, hey, that's anxiety. My just briefly, like I do remember being an anxious person. My dad even tells me, he said, you're a really nervous kid. And I'm like, well, Dad, telling me that doesn't necessarily like help me right now. But I sort of feel like my life's been pervaded by it. And, hopefully we'll get to it later in some Dharma perspectives. But, that can sound very, to others, that can sound like a very harsh thing. But actually, in some ways, it's been a gift. That it's not something that necessarily will go away from me, but it's something that I can work with. But I'm really curious back to like those intuitive. What do you think that was about? Was that about more like your tendency towards curiosity, or was that a specific practice that really prompted that for you? That because it sounds like there's a lot of curiosity and openness in your approach there.
I don't think it was a specific practice because I only had the instruction that I had, which was
Yeah.
sit down and feel your breath.
Yeah.
Um, but it was some kind of recognition that I am not just with this breath. I am like with this breath plus the next 50, and it's not working.
Yeah.
And so, from a Buddhist psychological perspective, at least in the Theravadan system, it wouldn't be like that kind of anxiety would not be seen as something pejorative. It's an energy imbalance, as you said,
Yeah.
or implied. And so we work in meditation with strengthening energy, but we also work with deepening calm and tranquility and concentration. And so if you maybe just by temperament or genetics, some reason you have a lot of energy, then it may tip over into a lot of anxiety and worry and restlessness and agitation, but it's energy. And so it could be balanced. And you don't have to like fritter away the energy or lose it or hate it, but you do want to bring some balance into your system so that it's like a better bet, going forward.
Yeah, and so that was something. It sounds like you just figured out as you worked with the simplicity of the practice. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. The reason I asked is because, actually one of the first Buddhist books I read was by Joseph, Insight Meditation. That was one of the first books I ever read. And I remember, without any teaching, just the book, sitting there with the instruction of, more Theravada style of shamatha vipassana. And it really helped me. I mean, that was the moment I was hooked. I was like, oh, I don't have to be my thought,
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think, what you're saying about energy imbalance is really important too, because, you've worked with so many people over the years, and sometimes we can put a really strong pressure on ourselves for a certain practice to work or be successful in the way we think it should be. So how did that kind of come up for you? Because it sounded like you figured out a way to work with that initially. Anything there that you remember?
Yeah, I mean, I think the opposite energy imbalance, which would be to have, relatively speaking, so much concentration compared to the amount of energy in your system, so that I would get sluggish and dull, and that would be more my prevalent tendency. There were periods like when I discovered like all that agitation or hypervigilance. But the other was like I had to wake up a lot, and develop some energy. And I used to hear about people because the way Goenka had those interviews with people, discussing your meditation practice, which was in a group. And I used to hear people talking about being insanely restless and all these fantasies. And I used to think, that sounds really exciting. Like, I don't have that going, I'm like sleeping.
Yeah.
And maybe it was just some understanding that we're working toward balance, which was, a lot to grasp because that's not what I thought meditation was about. I thought it was about wiping out thinking or wiping out negative feeling, and as many people do, and that wasn't working, so I wasn't having any of that successfully. So it was only with some exploration and teachings, really, that I came to understand that it was more about balance and having all kinds of different balance, both an energy balance with concentration and balance in the face of or meeting whatever is going on with greater balance.
Mm. Yeah, and that's the distinction you made. I mean, that's not an easy distinction. I think that took me a lot of years between, trying to get. I usually call it trying to get something in the meditation practice versus uncover or remove something, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, I'm curious. What else? What else for you is included in that sense of balance? Because I think we all know. I mean, all right, we all know what it feels like to some degree at some point in meditation to crave a meditation experience, to crave something different, to get that elusive concentration, or as you said, sort of no thought experience. But what's it like to crave balance, or can we crave balance? I mean, it's just sort of something that popped in my mind.
Well, I don't know if we'd crave balance so much as create balance, because the balance is largely, certainly within this system of practice, it's largely how we are relating to what's going on. It's not about what's going on.
Mm, mm,
So just as one example, one of the many possible methods of practicing mindfulness, say in the Burmese system, is using a mental label, so that you might actually silently be repeating in, out with the breath. And then when something becomes predominant, a sensation, a thought, an emotion, if the word comes easily, you silently again, place a label like joy, joy,
mm.
joy. So if you hear yourself repeating thinking, with utter contempt, that's a clue. That's not exactly a balanced relationship to the thinking. And
Got it.
that is actually a good feedback system, so you can say it again.
So what if I'm hearing you correctly? It's more in the narrative, like the unconscious, semi-conscious narrative that we're spinning. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
And so or even if it's conscious, we have a lot of feeling about it.
yeah, yeah.
I don't like this. This shouldn't be here. I knew I should have done a different method. Like, I knew I wasn't capable of growing in any way. Here it is again. Or, I mean, it's interesting sometimes to notice and even remember our common add-ons. And uh, Pali, the language of the original Buddhist text, it's called papancha. It
Mhm.
means proliferation, or as I heard one translator once describe it as the imperialistic tendency of mind. So something happens and the whole world is taken over. So the example I usually use is this time I was teaching with my colleague Joseph Goldstein, and Joseph and I were sitting in the kitchen of his place just having a cup of tea, and someone came in some distress and said to Joseph, I just had this really terrible experience. So Joseph said, well, what happened? And he said, I felt all this tension in my jaw, and I realized what an incredibly uptight person I am, and how I always have been and always will be. And Joseph said, you mean you felt a lot of tension in your jaw? And he said, yes, and I've never been able to get close to people. It's never going to change.
Mhm. Mm.
And Joseph said, you mean you felt a lot of tension in your jaw? And it was really interesting for me, like watching them go back and forth and back and forth. And finally, Joseph said something to him like, why are you adding a miserable self image to a painful experience? It's painful enough to feel the tension in your jaw, but now you have added, and I'm going to be alone for the rest of my life. So
Mm.
sometimes we see our kind of habitual add ons, sense of isolation. It's only me. Sense of permanence. This will last forever. This is the only thing I will ever feel. Sense of blame. I knew I should have, gotten it together 10 years ago. I wouldn't feel this anymore. There's so much that we just dump on the experience, which could be painful originally,
Mm.
so now we have all that extra suffering. And so that's a big part of understanding, like, oh, here's this emotion, here's this thought, here's this sensation. I can be with it in a different way.
Yeah, yeah, wonderful. Yeah, it's I think defining balance in that way is so much more different than how most of us think about it, because we think balance is the absence of pain, you know, and you're not saying that, right?
No,
Yeah,
although I am intrigued, by what you were saying earlier about a kind of energy balancing, which,
yeah,
um, is more prominent in some schools than others. But, I think about friends of mine, for example, who worked with healthcare professionals during the height of the pandemic. And a lot of it was kind of breathing exercises where, there's so many ways of describing it, but one way is, researchers say that if your out breath is longer than your in breath, then the parasympathetic nervous system will start taking over from the sympathetic nervous system, and like your blood pressure is likely to go down and you'll be more chill and things like that. And that was very important for people who were in a really often very tough situation, didn't have like a lot of time, or background
yeah.
to think about papancha, or proliferation. And it brought a different kind of balance to their nervous system right away. So maybe that's what you were meaning when you said you had to do some other practices.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's a lot in that. I think, this begs the question too. You and I both, you with obviously a lot more experience, but you and I both support, meditators and support people and just working with life and working with the suffering of life, which from the Buddhist perspective is inevitable. It's not something that we can choose not to have. And I always have this, that's why I'm curious, this sense of like, there's just the immediate need that people have to lessen the pain, myself included. And then I think what's so interesting in Buddha Dharma is it's then asking us to look a little bit deeper into the causes of that pain, not just the pain itself, which I think is a much harder lift for most people, myself included. And so I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. But just briefly, this practice we call vase breathing or bumchen in Tibetan, which is, technically used for more advanced yogic practices, but also there's a medical form of it, with an understanding of subtler energies in the body that when we use the breath in a certain way, this is usually done with some kind of a breath hold, but also breath elongation and abdominal breathing, that we can bring the energy that gets excessive in the chest, throat, head, we can bring it down. And, initially I just trusted, my teacher, Sonam Rinpoche, who also you're close with. And I just trusted him and I did it a lot and it worked. And it sort of gave me that foothold to then be able to work with the deeper truths around anxiety and my anxiety. So I think that, I see that's more and more necessary for people. Sometimes, I'm a big fan of working with the shadows of our life. And I've just noticed in mentoring people, some people you can't start there with them. It's just not relatable. It's too overwhelming.
Yeah, I think even going back to the idea of anxiety as an energy imbalance, there are many ways, that we might want to soothe that and create a different balance right there, including life practices, like some of them are like, listening to you, I actually had this memory of teaching in New York City. It was early March 2020. And I had just gotten back to New York, and anxiety was through the roof in the city, and people were getting sick, and people's parents were getting very sick sometimes. And so I was teaching somewhere in New York, and it was the kind of situation where the speaker sits with the audience until they're formally introduced, then they get up on the stage and speak. So I was sitting with the audience, and this woman next to me was massively anxious. And she said, I don't know if I should come, like Oh, this is a completely airless room down in the basement somewhere, and
Yeah.
I didn't know if I should come, and I said, well, there are these practices like adjusting the way you breathe and having your out breath be longer than your in breath that might soothe your system and bring you a better balance. And she wasn't interested. So then I said, well, there is this meditation of loving kindness, which also has that function of kind of soothing our system and helping us feel more connected and not so alone. She wasn't
Yeah.
interested. So then I looked at her and I said, is there anyone you could help? And she lit up. She
Mm.
said, I do have an elderly neighbor and maybe I can slip a note under her door and offer to get her groceries or whatever. And it's almost like it reminded me that sometimes when we are generous or we're kind, it unites us to a place within us that's not so anxious and not so desperate, and that's a really good thing to remember as well. I will
Yeah.
also say that another approach uh, within the meditation world, besides the soothing kind of calming, is creating space. Because if a really big energy, which is what anxiety is trying to move through a tight, enclosed, narrow space, it's going to be really jumbled.
Mm.
But if a big energy is trying to move through a bigger space, it can move. So maybe that's physical movement, walking, meditation, going outside and looking at the sky. If you're doing maybe listening to sound, if you're doing loving kindness meditation, loving kindness for all beings everywhere, and it's very personal, like what will help you experience that sense of space.
Yeah. Yeah. Wonderful. Yeah. I think, for me, it really comes down to that, how this relationship to space, both in my body. I mean, for me, probably the thing that's helped me the most, or the things, plural, with anxiety, at least in the last 15 to 20 years, is embodiment practices. And that's because I've learned to do them. Um, I've learned to create space through them. But for a lot of people, when they go into the body, it's not possible. It feels even more
Mhm.
like you said, like a tight, narrow space. So I think I love that you brought in loving kindness and also just physical movement, opening up to our natural surroundings to remind us of that. You know, Going to a little bit more traditional Buddhism, though we have been talking about it the whole time. This sense of how we relate to self, how we contract into self. You know, I think this perspective is really interesting. It's a little bit of a lift because often it becomes philosophical. But I think, essentially when I hear you talk about loving kindness and this element of looking towards what others need, or what would be, getting interested in the happiness of others, what that may look like, and actually practicing that and how that helps us. For me, over some time of loving kindness practice, just the connection sort of came to fruition of like, oh, that's because I'm not obsessed with myself right now, and therefore my anxiety lessens. So I don't know if you have anything kind of to add to that, or say around that, because you teach loving kindness so beautifully, and one of your main things you teach. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting experience that you're describing. That you've had, and it makes a lot of sense to me because some really painful experiences, like physical pain, certain emotions, they're like magnets, and we get very
Mm.
involuted and self preoccupied, and they just build and build because of that. And something happens when we remember we're not so alone, and
Yeah.
uh, this is part of the human condition, or it's not like our personal fault or flaw, that this is something people experience, and or that we live in an interconnected universe, that's actually the truth of things. It's not something we have to make up, or superimpose. That's actually how things are. And so it's a very different felt sense that happens.
Yeah. Yeah. And why do you think this is so difficult to connect with nowadays? Like, I do see this is, a subjective opinion, but I do see, I have this question always, is like anxiety getting worse, or is it just we're losing cultural tools to work with it? What's that about? Do you see that? What's your take on that?
I suspect it's getting worse. There's uh for some people there's a kind of nihilism, or there's no meaning anywhere
Yeah.
kind of feeling, and that of course makes things much harder in terms of anxiety, because uh you may not feel focused, you may not feel there's a north star like guiding your life in some way. um Probably the way we live. I was once interviewed by this journalist about doom scrolling, and I didn't know what the
Yeah.
word meant
Yeah.
until the interview. And I said, "What's doom scrolling?" And I thought, "Oh, yeah, I do that." Like and if anyone doesn't know what it means, it's basically, say you're on your phone, you're reading this basically the same story 30,000 times.
Yeah.
You're not getting new information or a fresh perspective. It's just the same, written by someone else, and you're just reading and reading and reading and reading and reading, and then you're filled with anxiety and dread
Yeah.
and so on. So bad habits too, you know.
Yeah. My doom scrolling lately, I'm just laughing because I basically like scroll Instagram for memes on fatherhood, and they're often really, really funny. And they're sort of relatable because, I'm struggling. I'm a new father. My daughter's just over a year old. And so, just seeing the meme and seeing I'm not alone. Like, there's other fathers struggling with the exact same thing because they were able to present a really humorous meme,
Mhm.
through it. And it's really comforting. I don't know if that's quite doom scrolling. It may be like doom comforting. I don't know.
Yeah,
Scrolling.
no, I don't think that's doom scrolling. I don't think that qualifies. That sounds like maybe not a bad thing to do.
Yeah, I actually I was analyzing it a little bit because I'm like, should I keep doing that? And then I realized actually it's kind of like I feel connected to people through doing it. So here's where people might say, oh, like tech is creating more anxiety. I think it can, but I have this experience where it actually is comforting. I feel heard. I feel like connected with others. So um, yeah, this what you were mentioning about the nihilism, about the you know it's almost like a lack of positive hope, and it just spirals in itself, you know more or less trying to solve the problem through more, I guess we could say like negativity bias, or sort of spiraling into ourself. Have you, I mean, obviously you've named them, but what practices have you seen from the Buddhist tradition, from mindfulness and the way you teach it, to really work well for those kinds of ailments when people are really struggling with, I would call that like, a darkness in a quite a harmful way. Yeah.
I think it's an experiment. It's a question of exploring. There's probably no one thing, and it's good to
Yeah.
have kind of alternatives, like a bunch of tools that you try. And if something is not working, doesn't mean you failed, it's just in that moment, try something else. Uh, Walking meditation is really good, like moving the energy. Um, Loving kindness is really good, so we do have that fundamental sense of connection to others that's reinforced, as well as to our own inner strengths. And going back to maybe the original thing you asked about negativity bias, um, it's going to sound really phony and weird, but doing something like gratitude practice,
Mm,
just many psychologists will say that if we wrote down, say at the end of the day, 3 things we're grateful for from the day, that would be a very healing thing to do. And for many of us, including me, that doesn't come naturally. I'm so much more conditioned to come to the end of the day and think about what I didn't do right and what other
mm.
people didn't do right. And back in my traveling days, there was always an airline, and there's always something. And for me, it's not force, it's not coercion, but it's intentionality. Like anything else happened today, anything good, and kind of remembering that so we don't feel so bereft.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. You know, you also practice Tibetan Buddhism to to a certain extent, even though you mostly teach from Theravada tradition. We have all these practices of what look like devotional practices where you're kind of thinking about something else. On initial glance, they can look like you're giving power to something else. And the more I've had to translate those for myself culturally, the more I've found they're not at all about giving the power to something else, the Buddha or a teacher or a lineage. It's more about appreciation.
Mm-hmm.
And so these are kind of the daily practices I do around appreciation, connected to, obviously teachers that have benefited me a lot in my life, the Buddha, the Dharma itself, but also just like you said, gratitude and appreciation for just the things around me that are supportive, that are working, and even the things around me that are maybe cause struggles, like even, appreciating my anxiety. I mean, this brings me back to a point I wanted to make earlier, but I'll say it now. Um, really leaning into it, especially through practices like the handshake practice, through Sun Rinpoche's teachings, which well as well. We talked about that last time. It sort of allowed this other process of like, well, maybe anxiety doesn't need to go away. Maybe I just need ways to work with it, manage it, not be sort of overwhelmed and overtaken by it. So I don't know. It's led me to that deeper, I guess, hypothesis or process, but also, the overall process of working with dukkha, and I think I'd love to hear, you've already been talking on them, but I'd love to hear if you want to go a little bit deeper into, especially the three characteristics, right? Three marks of existence, which often can seem so pessimistic when people read them, but actually there's something to get curious about as how we then, I don't like to use this word resolve, but how we resolve the human predicament or the predicament of life. So I'm curious if you can connect that into anxiety, or you have any thoughts on that.
Well, to start with, like one of the many ways mindfulness can be defined is a quality of awareness that's connected to what's happening in the present moment without kind of buying into it and getting submerged in it on the one side, or pushing against it, trying to make it go away or deny it on the other side. So sometimes we talk about mindfulness as the place in the middle, or the relationship that's in the middle,
Mm.
between kind of getting overwhelmed by something or just liking it or being afraid of it and trying to make it go away. And if we develop more and more that relationship to our experience, including to difficult experience, a painful experience, then we are creating the ground for seeing more deeply into it. And it makes sense, right? If a certain emotion comes up and you hate it right away and you try to pretend you're not feeling it, there's not going to be a lot of learning going on.
Yeah.
And at the same time, if you're consumed by it, like, yes, I'm going to get them, and then I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that, and there's not going to be a lot of learning going on because you're too lost in it. And so that's the particular way we're practicing paying attention. And it's very common, maybe we've talked about this before, these days, in kind of the popularization of mindfulness, to think about it largely as benefiting us because we more fully live our lives. And that, of course, is a great benefit. It's
Yeah.
like if you're not always multitasking, for example, and sometimes you're drinking that cup of tea and feeling the warmth of the teacup and smelling the tea and tasting the tea, rather than drinking the tea while you're Zooming, while you're checking your email, while you're doing 15 other things at the same time. That's a much fuller life, and it's a much better way to live. But of course, classically, the main benefit of mindfulness was not so much inhabiting our lives, although that's great. It was understanding our lives.
Mm.
It's for the arising and evolution of wisdom or insight. Because if we're paying attention, we see more deeply. So when I describe myself understanding some things about the way fear works within me. That's a personal insight. And then there are many, you could say, universal insights. Same material, looking at fear, looking at joy, looking at anger, whatever it might be, but seeing what are considered to be more universal truths. And so those are the three characteristics
Yeah.
that you're describing. I think in the Chinese tradition, they have a saying, if you want to understand the nature of water, look at the waves.
Mm.
So that's what we're doing. It's not like you can only see a deeper truth if you're looking at bliss and joy and delight and peace. And, so if somebody said to me, would you prefer to have a deeper understanding about impermanence, say, looking at bliss or looking at knee pain? I'd say bliss, but no one gives us a menu really. and that knee pain is not a waste of time. It's not like a terrible sign. You can't learn anything. Because if we look within anything, if these are really universal truths, these characteristics, that's what we should see.
Yeah, yeah.
Right. And so I don't know what language in the Tibetan tradition particularly they would use, in the Burmese they would say impermanence
Yeah.
as one, and dukkha, which the old fashioned translation, which I like a lot, is suffering.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't just mean like horrible suffering. It could mean insecurity or kind of the poignancy of life,
Yeah.
And then emptiness or emptiness of self, contingency, there are lots of ways of describing that third one. And this is what it said we see when we look at the heart of anything. And so rather than bemoan one's fate, like never have any bliss, I'm never going to get anywhere. It's actually okay. It's hard to believe, but it's actually okay.
Yeah, it's interesting. I have a harder time meditating on the impermanence of bliss, actually. So meaning like for me, when there's an experience that I have aversion towards, it's easier to see the aversion. Where when I have a lot of pleasure going on, it really sucks me in. It's much harder to actually work with it.
Yeah.
But necessary. Yeah, and in the Tibetan tradition, they're the same. We add on nirvana is beyond extremes to the end. Sometimes in the Tibetan tradition, they follow the four seals, which are basically a Mahayana sutra where the Buddha then added on this fourth seal of nirvana to the three characteristics, but it's basically the same. Yeah, and I love how you introduced it as something to these three characteristics as something to uncover through mindfulness, not as something we need to necessarily believe in and or like will ourselves to get. It has to be seen directly. Yeah. They have to be seen. Yeah. Yeah. There's something in here that I think is the deeper lift. And I guess in a way, it just takes time to get interested in that deeper lift of, sometimes in the Tibetan tradition, we would describe this as, that fourth seal of nirvana beyond extremes. And we could describe those extremes in many different ways. How do you say it? Existence and non-existence, or subject object is a type of extreme. But I think in the language we've been using so far, I think there's this extreme of temporary happiness and suffering. And, I call that a deeper lift because that's not immediately like everyone's like, well, I want to practice meditation to experience more happiness. And then the Buddha's like, oh, and that also is dukkha, So any thoughts on that, just sort of and maybe just from your own experience? It doesn't even have to be necessarily in how others need to experience that,
Yeah, I mean, I think it actually makes sense to me to want to experience more happiness. It's just that most of us have a big confusion about where happiness is actually going to come from, and so there are kinds of happiness. We could say they're also dukkha, they're also changing, but they're actually better, than the opposite. Like if you have a kind of morally compromised life, lots of deceit, and you're paranoid all the time, like what if anyone finds out? That's not really helpful, and And it doesn't have to be that way.
Yeah.
We can have a kind of cleaner, simpler life with more joy and less fear around, what if anyone finds out? And,
Yeah.
so that's a good thing, I think, to approach. But, well, if we think, well, happiness is going to be an only pleasurable experience and there's never going to be the arising of anything uncomfortable, that's unrealistic.
Yeah.
But that's also how most of us are brought up. Like, if you accumulate enough stuff, things won't change, you'll be safe. Or
Yeah.
if you put down other people, you'll feel so much better about yourself. Or, if you devote yourself endlessly to revenge, you'll be strong. Or if you are compassionate, you'll be stupid. Like, there's a lot of conditioning often to unwind about really where happiness is to be found.
Yeah. Yeah. I think this is the deepest conditioning for me, for sure. I mean, just as I said, around anxiety, that it's somehow I'm doing something wrong if I'm
Mm-hmm.
experiencing anxiety, or there's something wrong with me. And God, I mean, I think it's kind of a relief to share it here with you. I think it's really only been in the last like 3 to 5 years that I've just accepted this is part of my embodied experience. This
Mm-hmm.
life, this
Mm-hmm.
is part of my cultural experience, maybe even biological. Like I inherited some of this,
Mm-hmm.
and it's okay. It's okay to work with it. So
Mm-hmm.
I know there's almost for me there's that creates more relief than the practice sometimes. Just knowing that
Yeah.
it's okay,
Yeah.
something exists as it does. Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah,
Well, that's a part of practice in some ways. I mean, it's not always the product of practice. Maybe it came from somewhere else,
yeah.
but it's part of what we bring into practice, because otherwise we're judging ourselves a lot,
Yeah, I think I became really exhausted with that. And a lot of the people I work with and teach, as I'm sure as do you experience in your teaching work, is yeah, we're just fighting ourselves so much. You named it earlier. We sometimes describe it as the second arrow, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so coming from that parable or story of the Buddha, um, yeah, and it's a tough one. I feel like that is kind of half the battle, just working with that second arrow. Yeah, yeah. Um,
Indeed.
Sharon, anything you'd like to share, or possibly do you want to lead us in a short, practice of your choice on sort of working with anxiety for even for 5 minutes? It doesn't have to be long. Does that feel good to you?
Sure. I don't know if it'll be specifically around working with anxiety because maybe you're sleepy tonight or whatever. But
Oh, that's true. That the listener might not be experiencing. Well, they could hit pause and come back to it when when they are.
I think actually it might be interesting to do some breath practice and perhaps to do that kind of conscious breath with breath, if that works for somebody. And then we'll move into, I think, just to kind of open more general mindfulness. Okay.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah.
Okay. So uh, please sit comfortably. You can close your eyes or not. However, you feel most at ease, whatever's appropriate. And just let your energy settle into your body. And to start with, as I said, just for some practice with it, see if you can breathe in to whatever count seems right to you and breathe out a little bit longer. And just feel what might be happening in your body, your nervous system as a result of that. Then you can allow the breath to become natural, whatever rhythm is happening and perhaps it's changing. And for a few moments, open to listening to sound, whatever sound is predominant, maybe the sound of my voice or other sounds. It is a way of relaxing deep inside, experiencing some sense of spaciousness. Of course, we like certain sounds and we don't like others, but we don't have to chase after them to hold on or push away. Just unless you are responsible for responding to the sound, just let it wash through you. Bring your attention to the feeling of your body sitting, whatever sensations you discover. See if you can feel the earth supporting you. And feel space touching you. Usually we think about touching space. Think about picking up a finger and poking it in the air, but space is already touching us. It's always touching us. We just need to receive it. In that same gentle way, bring your attention back to the feeling of the breath, just the normal, natural breath, wherever you feel it most distinctly, the nostrils, the chest, or the abdomen. Find that place, bring your attention there, and just rest. It's just one breath. You don't have to worry about what's already gone by. You don't have to lean forward for even the very next breath. Just this one. And if sensations or emotions or images should arise, but they're not very strong, if you can stay connected to the feeling of the breath, just let them flow on by. You're breathing. It's just one breath. If they are strong, they pull you away. See if you can recognize them. It's joy, it's sorrow, it's thinking, whatever it might be, with or without a word. The word doesn't really matter. But recognize them in a balanced way without judgment. See if you can let go. Bring your attention back to the feeling of the breath. And for all those perhaps many times you're just gone, you fall asleep, spun out in a fantasy, don't worry about it. You can realize you've been gone. See if you can gently let go of whatever. Bring your attention back to the feeling of the breath. when you feel ready, you can open your eyes or lift your gaze, and we'll end the meditation.
Masterful. That was so helpful, Sharon. Really
Thank you.
amazing. Yeah. Thank you so much for offering that to myself and all the listeners who will benefit from that. So Sharon, thank you so much for joining me for this conversation. I feel it was a rich one, and as always, I just really appreciate your wisdom. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Okay. Well, anything you have going on that you'd love to share with people? Anything?
I don't know exactly when this podcast will come out, but the best thing is just to look at my website, because
Yeah.
it's SharonSalzberg.com, and my schedule will be on there. So
Yeah. Awesome. Your book came out a little while ago, but are you still doing some things around that? So
well, Real Life, which was book number 12, it's coming out in paperback in April, so that'll be happening.
oh, perfect. Yeah, this will come out in March, so that's great.
Okay, yeah.
So go, please check out Sharon's latest book. Yeah, Real Life. It's an awesome book.
Thank
All right,
you.
Sharon. Well, thanks so much.
Bye bye. Take care.
Take care.